camera's almost too clear. Hey, welcome back to A Piece of Elise, and as you can see, I am still in one piece. So, this evening I'll be reviewing A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole, the late and great comedic genius. This was such an amazing book. I read it 2 years ago. I reread it last week. It's actually the first book I've read twice. That's hard to say. But again, it's just so amazing. I can't really emphasize that, but I will do my best and try in the upcoming segments. I'm still not sure what I want the exact structure of this channel to be, but I do know that I don't really want to obsessively outline every single chapter and give away too much, because if you have the attention span and time to watch that, I think you may as well read the book logically. And I also want you to be left wanting more, like in case you do want to ultimately read the book, which I hope I inspire within you. Before I take you through this whimsical gem of a novel, I will give you a brief history of the book. So Toole wrote this novel in his early 20s, which is in itself pretty miraculous and unreal, considering what I think to be the sheer brilliance of the book. And the quality of writing is just beyond impressive for someone in their 20s, let alone for anyone. So yeah, that is an interesting factoid, I think. And he actually tried getting it published 9 times by 9 different publications, but each and every one of them rejected him, which took a little bit of a toll on his psyche, it seems to be. So Toole's mother, Thelma, is solely responsible for getting this book published. It's rumored that she actually stalked and cornered a famous writer named Walker Percy, who wrote the foreword to this book, and she basically demanded that he read it, and he instantly fell in love with it. And it was published in 1980, which was 3 years after he vouched for it, and ultimately 11 years after Toole committed suicide. Near the end of the book, actually, the main character is talking about his writing pads that are all around his room with important information and jottings. And it says in the book, "We must never let them fall into the hands of my mother. She may make a fortune from them. It would be too ironic." And I guess it is ironic because that's ultimately what ended up happening. So kind of eerie foresight. So I think it's possible that the frustration that came with having his book rejected by 9 different publications certainly was a factor and a catalyst, among others, that added to Toole's untimely passing. But if we kind of look back to his history and the events leading to his suicide, we'll see that he was extremely paranoid, and it got worse and worse and worse the months leading up to his death. And it even got to the point where he was a professor and he would constantly be yelling at his students and telling them that people were plotting against him, but just really sad stuff. But the book is littered with quotes about paranoia, such as, quote, "Is my paranoia getting completely out of hand, or are you mongoloids really talking about me?" And the protagonist's close friend actually continuously says that she's worried that he's extremely paranoid and is losing touch with reality. It's unclear, and of course it always will be, if these are predictions interwoven with subtle indicators of what he was going through, or just sheer coincidence. Probably a mix of both. Someone who seemed to be so brilliant and displayed such self-awareness, it's doubtful that his lack of literary success drove him to such a extreme act. I think it's more likely struggle with mental health, and mental health has infinite definitions, but strangely can't really be defined, and it's so personal to every individual and takes form in many different shapes and tones, so we'll never really know what happened there, of course. But fiction often gets its roots from reality, and it's almost overwhelming, I found, when you're reading the book, just to have such an intimate look inside Toole's inner struggle, especially when you know what fate awaited him. So having said all that, it's a very sad backstory, but resulted in the funniest book I've ever read, hands down. And as we know, tragedy and comedy often go hand in hand, and in probably half the reviews I read, people say that they aren't the type to laugh out loud at books, and I concur with that opinion. Other than Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's been, I don't think, one other book that I've guffawed at as many times as I have at this one. It's just, yeah, kind of something to behold, let me tell you. I don't know about you, but when I hit my funny bone, I laugh uncontrollably. It's such a weird, strange feeling, and it's insanely painful, but I still can't help but burst into laughter. I don't know why that is. I know it's called the funny bone because it's the humorous bone, but for the most part, I just thought it was because people can't stop laughing, but I think I'm one of the few. But either way, that's kind of how I felt when I was reading this book. I was so giddy and just laughing sporadically throughout the entire piece. But there was also a pain that accompanied that, because when I read between the lines or even paid attention to some of the direct quotes, I realized that there's just such a profound sadness within the author that I couldn't fully just take it at face value and laugh at all of the little nuances. So for example, I noticed he refers to the main character Ignatius as feeling isolated and detached from society way more than I did the first time, I guess because I was kind of zeroed in on it and looking for, you know, instances like this. And I noticed quotes such as, Ignatius felt as alone as he had felt on that dark day in high school when in a chemistry laboratory his experiment had exploded, burning his eyebrows off. So again, I think if you pay attention to the latter half of that sentence, it's just funny and then you move on. But again, I think just knowing what we know, it has a little bit more of an impact when we view it that way. One of the side characters in this book, Dorian, he, regarding Ignatius, said, some people are simply too much to bear. And I think it stands to reason that the same people that are too much to bear might find the world too much to bear. So again, I think this might go hand in hand. And there's just little quotes and subtle references that are peppered throughout the novel that I just picked up on, which again made it more sad than I expected. Thanks for bearing with me through all of that philosophical mumbo jumbo. Let's get to the meat of the sandwich, people. A green hunting cap squeezed the top of the fleshy balloon of a head. This is the first line of the book, one that I still laugh at every time I cross it. But this isn't the last you hear of Ignatius's green hat. It's essentially a fixture of his anatomy, since he literally never leaves the house without it, or is ever referenced doing anything without it. The comedic hero and villain of this story is the main character, Ignatius J. Riley, who is a 30-year-old, highly eccentric and pretentious man who lives in New Orleans and spends his days nagging his mum Irene, floating in the tub for hours, and writing an indictment against our century. He likes the comforts of the modern age, but isn't so keen on the idea of work, and thinks he should be exempt from employment. At the beginning of the book, his mum crashes their car as a result of Ignatius incessantly pestering her, and he has to get a job to help pay for the damages. And the entire book is essentially him bumbling around from job to job and taking down anyone who is unfortunate enough to meet him on his destructive path. Some of these jobs include working at a clothing factory called Levy Pants, where he manages to rile up a bunch of coworkers into conducting a very unjustified protest, almost single-handedly destroying the company. And after that, he works as a hot dog vendor and can't help but eat all of the wieners while he anxiously tramps around town looking for the nearest movie theater in hopes of finding a flick that he can audibly criticize, much to the chagrin of the rest of the audience. So Ignatius's only friend is a woman named Myrna, who he met in university and who now lives in New York. So they're basically just pen pals, but that, I guess, maybe a generous way to put it. He refers to all of her letters as an abomination, and it seems like the only thing they have in common is the love and desire to have debates. Myrna is extremely liberal and he's a staunch conservative, almost identifying as a medievalist and childlike in terms of his attitude and discuss repulsion around sex. In their letters, they're always trying to outsmart one another and have the last word. And I think this is a theme throughout the novel. Nearly every character is always trying to be a step ahead of their counterparts and ultimately being run by their ego and superiority complex, basically. I think pretty much all of the characters were one-dimensional, in my opinion, except Ignatius, but I think that was orchestrated on purpose just because the main focal point of the novel had to center around Ignatius and kind of his hypocrisies and madness, so to speak. So I thought they complemented the story very well, and I really liked all of the characters. There's some really hilarious side characters that are quite memorable. I also found that they all lacked self-awareness to a very large degree, except a character called Gus Levy, who was, I thought, the moral compass of the book and the diamond amongst a bunch of rough and tumble characters who were really just emotionally vacant human beings, I think, at the end of the day. Ignatius studied medieval philosophy and was fascinated by a 4th century philosopher named Boethius, whose book, The Consolation of Philosophy, served as a Bible of sorts to Ignatius, and he believes in Fortuna, who is referred to in Boethius's book as Greek goddess of fortune and luck, and he believes she is single-handedly controlling his destiny. So you could say Ignatius essentially believes in determinism, which is defined as a philosophical idea that every event or state of affairs, including every human decision and action, is the inevitable and necessary consequence of antecedent states of affairs. Since he believes in determinism, aka Fortuna, he thinks that nothing is his fault and that fate is out to get him, constantly saying things like he has a faulty valve that closes up, making it hard for him to breathe. But of course, it only acts up whenever he is in a stressful situation. All this to say that he seemingly surrenders to the idea that we have no free will, and refers to Fortuna's power throughout the novel, saying things like, "Oh, Fortuna, blind, heedless goddess, I am strapped to your wheel. Do not crush me beneath your spokes," or, "What vicious trick is Fortuna playing on me now?" In believing in Fortuna, Ignatius subscribes to the belief that he isn't responsible for his actions, and, therefore, that should mean other people aren't responsible for their actions either. But he doesn't afford this luxury to anyone else, and seems to detest every character in the novel, which seems nonsensical, but this is pretty much the definition of Ignatius, so maybe it makes perfect sense. I think some of my favorite things that happen in the novel occur in a bar called the Night of Joy, and there's some really hilarious and memorable characters that work in that bar. I think you'll just have to read it to unravel the whole masterpiece that is this book. I also really enjoyed the parts where Ignatius went to the movie theater. He literally just went there for the sole purpose to criticize the films and point out the parts that he found perverse, and would scream at the top of his lungs in front of the audience with abandon. And I just thought there was something about that that was just so original and silly that I really liked. He said some extremely offensive things at the theater, which would more than likely get him kicked out, if not banned, right away and put on global news. But I mean, this was the 60s, so give the guy a break. The book is somewhat cartoon-like in its antics, and sometimes there's chapters which seem completely random and serve no purpose, but for me, that was a big part of the fun. And I read a lot of nonfiction and authors such as Dostoevsky, so to have in essence a Seinfeld-esque type book that I still managed to derive meaning from was really refreshing, and I just really enjoyed the change. I consider it a book about nothing that somehow speaks infinite volumes. At the very end of the book, Ignatius catches himself feeling grateful towards Myrna, which is a rare emotion for him since it's a positive one. And he describes this feeling as ironic, probably because he's not used to admiring anyone but himself, and he actually is relishing the moment and enjoying it instead of scrutinizing it, which is, I think he realizes, a nice change for him. I'd like to think that this meant that for the first time in life he was riding Fortuna's wave instead of resisting it at every turn and swimming away from what he believes is fated. And I'd also like to think this means that Ignatius may have just given up the war and is going to opt to see the good and find humor in the absurd instead of detesting it, because in the end, since he's tethered to Fortuna's wheel, he may as well just sit back and enjoy the ride. So in conclusion, I think that there was a lot of racism and sexism and offensive things said throughout the book, mainly by Ignatius, but also other characters. And I think he would certainly be a troll in our modern era, perusing the internet endlessly and targeting anyone that didn't meet his moral standard. But again, it was written in the 60s, and it's obvious to me that Toole is over-exaggerating his character's lack of tact for comedic effect. I think if we can't express our deepest insecurities and politically incorrect, intrusive thoughts through literature, if you will, in the beautiful confines of book bindings, I don't know where we can, people. We can extrapolate what the book means all day and question Toole's intentions and what his agenda was, but since I'm the one doing the review, I'd like to think that Toole was maybe warning us not to take life too seriously and be overtaken by our neuroses, and was encouraging us to embrace the fact that each and every one of us, in our own way, is nothing more, nothing less than a dunce.
Yeah, Jordan James, man 40. I need to step back, get a new perspective. Funny, I need a break in order to be progressive. Addictive personality starting to get obsessive. Maybe I'm making fans, but friends I am getting less of. I need to get this train on the track, finding my brain, get it back. Kid is insane when he raps, yeah. I need to work to earn what I eat. I'm working to murder the beat with shit that I learned from the street, yeah. And there's a chance I will make it, there's a chance I won't. I've gotta try, I will never know if I don't.